Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a statement by Fergus Ewing on the Renewables Obligation Scotland review announcement. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be therefore no interventions or interruptions. I call on Fergus Ewing. Minister, you have 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, the Renewables Obligation, or RO, is a vital component of our efforts to increase Scotland's renewable energy production. The mechanism is established, it is understood and it is effective. The value of the RO to Scotland, the powers which it has exercised on behalf and with the approval of this Parliament, and the need to respect and protect those powers is a subject that I will return to during this afternoon's debate. Since 2002, successive administrations have used these devolved powers to support new generation across Scotland, from onshore wind and hydro to, much more recently, offshore wind, wave and tidal projects. These devolved powers have always been used carefully and responsibly. We know and we understand the value which our stakeholders place on as much consistency as possible across the UK. But where Scotland's needs or priorities have differed from the rest of the UK, then the RO in Scotland has reflected that difference. None of this is done lightly. Any change to the mechanism, particularly in Scotland alone, is based on open dialogue with all interested parties and a careful appreciation of the implications. And so, I am pleased to announce to Parliament that the Scottish Government is today publishing its decisions on changes to the Renewables Obligation Scotland mechanism. This follows a detailed consultation on the proposals which closed earlier this year. A review raised a wide range of issues and sought views on some significant changes to the support under the RO, as well as the criteria against which eligibility for that support are judged. The changes which we are now proposing to make, and which will be subject to the approval of this Parliament, are as follows. First of all, we have listened carefully to the many responses on a proposed reduction for hydro generation. Scotland has a proud and world-renowned heritage in this form of power generation. While the stations that can still be built may be on a smaller scale, their contribution to our energy mix and renewables targets remain important. We accept that there are conditions and challenges facing the development of such capacity in Scotland which increase the associated investment risk. For that reason, we have decided to retain the hydro rock band in Scotland at its current level. Our consultation also raised the issue of extra support for innovative offshore wind. Scotland has huge offshore wind generation potential, but much of that resource is located in far greater water depths than elsewhere around the UK. It is thus considerably more challenging and costly to exploit. I believe that a new band for the testing of floating turbines and other innovative offshore wind deployment in deep waters would help tap that resource, bring costs down and create benefits for Scotland. We will work on the detailed structure and design of such a band and consult on our proposal in due course. On biomass generation, we had asked for views on whether or not to restrict or remove support for large-scale, wood-fuelled, electricity-only and CHP, combined heat and power, stations. A significant majority responded in favour of such restrictions, with others arguing that biomass generation has an important role to play in meeting Scotland's electricity and heat targets. I accept that role, but I also believe that our concerns over competition for the finite supply of wood and our concerns about the strategic value of biomass heat over electricity merits the introduction of a new control. I am therefore proposing that wood-fuelled stations with a total installed capacity greater than 10 megawatts and which aren't good quality combined heat and power stations will not be eligible for ROCs after 2013. This will not apply to stations which commission after April 2013 but which received consent or planning permission before our consultation was published. Our vision for biomass, Presiding Officer, is clear. Small sustainable stations close to available local supplies operating as efficiently as possible. We announced in July our intention to reduce support for onshore wind by 10%. I am happy to confirm that decision today, and also that the band will remain at that level for the review period, that is until 2017. As with all technologies, we will revisit this band should evidence on costs emerge which were to justify such a course of action. However, we made clear in July that evidence to support a further reduction does not exist at present, and I know that clarity was helpful in concentrating the minds of the UK Government to reach the same conclusion. For all other areas, we intend to make the same changes as are to apply across the rest of the UK. These include proposed levels of support, subject to a further short consultation for higher levels of co-firing with biomass. This support will provide an option for the continued and cleaner operation of the large thermal generation at Longannet Power Station and is thus of strategic value. We will be looking at ways to ensure that the biomass fuel for such a venture is sourced from sustainable imports. Our desire for as consistent an approach as possible means that we will also be consulting shortly in the same terms as the UK Government on issues including solar PV banding, additional cost controls for biomass generation and the future of certain types of small-scale generation technology under the RO. This has been a lengthy process but born of necessity. The changes in question will guide the development of renewables generation across Scotland for the next 4 years. It has been vital that the Scottish Government listen closely, consider carefully and decide appropriately. I am confident that we have done so and that the RO will continue to deliver a new generation at an affordable cost to consumers. Presiding Officer, I am happy to take questions from colleagues regarding today's announcement.
I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next debate. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question of the Minister on the issues raised in his statement could press the request to speak button now. I call Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Minister for a prior sight of his statement, and indeed can I welcome the statement and much of the content therein. I wrote to the Minister regarding the RO obligations, and I'm really glad that he has taken on board what we had to say regarding hydro and biomass. I hope he hasn't closed the door to our third request regarding additional tariffs for the islands, and maybe discussion can be ongoing on that. Can I also welcome the announcement about a ROC for innovative offshore wind development? He will be aware that any delay in announcing this RO could also have a delay on development in this area. And therefore, can I ask him what form that further consultation will take, when that will be issued, and indeed when he'll be in a position to announce the results of that consultation so that we can move forward with these developments?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful indeed for Rhoda Grant's support and that from Labour colleagues, and I pay tribute to the work that, in particular, Sarah Boyack has done on this issue over the years. I think this has been taken forward in a way that has been largely cross-party, and that is very much to be welcomed. With regard to the point as regards tariffs for the islands, yes, I think this is more a matter for debate later in the afternoon. So I think, if I may, I won't comment on that at the current time, but address that in my remarks in the ensuing debate, as it's not within the ambit of the announcement on ROCs that I've made this afternoon. Regarding the specific question which you asked about the timescale of consultation on the proposed banding for innovative wind, it's our intention that a consultation paper will be issued in October, and that the parties most directly involved in looking at those potential innovative solutions will, of course, be consulted, as will the whole renewable sector and all of those who are involved in bringing down the costs of offshore wind, whether it be fixed and floating. And I hope in particular that this will be of interest to those companies and organisations that may be considering developing or assisting in working with Scottish-based companies to develop some of the ports and harbours around our shores. And I think, without starting to get into specifics, which I shouldn't really do, there is at least one port, one well-known port, which I see Rhoda Grant is thinking of as I speak, which may potentially benefit from such development. We want to see us develop our renewable potential in Scotland and see Scottish jobs created in Scottish ports, towns and harbours and islands. And that is something that I think will be aided by the work that we look to do together with Rhoda Grant and our colleagues in taking forward a specific Scottish solution to encouraging the innovative technology, which is of course appropriate for the fact that we have deeper waters and therefore non-fixed solutions to seabed must be ones which are fully explored, and therefore we will take that forward in the timescale that I've indicated.
Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. Can I also thank the Minister for an advance copy of today's statement and congratulate him on being able to read Rhoda Grant's mind. We also fully welcome this statement. Scottish Conservatives welcome retaining the Hydro Rock Band at its current level, given the conditions and challenges facing these developments at the present time. We're very pleased to hear of the further consultations and indeed the positive engagement with the UK Government on solar PV banding and certain types of small-scale generation. One of my questions was on the start of the consultation for innovative offshore, and I welcome the fact that that will start as soon as next month. My question is on biomass. Given the finite supply of wood, the measures taken on rocks for biomass appear sensible. However, I wonder if we can ask if there is any potential for some flexibility regarding biomass development plans which may have received planning permission during or after the consultation was done and may have incurred considerable sums of money in preparation.
Minister.
Well, I welcome the comments which Rhoda Grant has made, and I'm pleased that both in Scotland and south of the border, both indeed south of the border and in Scotland, that we have maintained support for onshore wind. In regard to the points as regards timing, I did in the statement refer to the fact that those applications which have already received planning permission will be treated differently, and I think that's fair because they were made, if you like, under the radar before this current consultation. So I think that's the correct approach. With regard to biomass, she's perfectly correct. We've listened very carefully to the interests of the timber sector, looking at it at its most broad. There are a huge number of people employed in the timber sector in Scotland, especially in the area that we jointly represent, and leading Scottish companies such as BSW, Brownlees, in Boat of Garton and Fort William, and Gordon's in Nairn, or James Jones in Forres, and many sawmills throughout the country have been very concerned that very large-scale biomass for electricity only would consume much of the limited, finite source of timber in Scotland and receive a subsidy in so doing, one which is not available to the timber users, the sawmills, and of course Norbord have a substantial plant near Inverness, as Mary Scanlon well knows. It's fair to say we listen very carefully indeed to their views and also the views of the other respondees to the consultation. There were 139, and we also listened carefully to the views of MSPs who wrote to us, I think, from across the chamber about environmental concerns, about large-scale biomass for electricity only. So taking all of that into account, the preponderance of views expressed to us from representatives and in the consultation was that a limit to 10 megawatt cap was appropriate. That will still allow smaller scale community biomass schemes to operate successfully in the Highlands. And she and I will know that there are many companies that operate very well, and I think it's reasonable to mention HW Energy, who've installed around 200 biomass boilers. I know that because I kind of opened one of them at the Black Isle Brewery last Friday.
Right, Mackenzie, followed by Ken McIntosh.
I'd like to welcome this statement. I'm sure it will provide both support and reassurance to the renewable industry. But I wondered if the Minister would care to expand a bit? You mentioned at the start of the statement the importance of wave and tidal generation, and I wonder if you could remind the Chamber what support the Scottish Government is giving to those technologies and what the impact, the potential impact of them would be across the Highlands and Islands region.
Minister.
Well, Mike Mackenzie is absolutely right to draw attention to the importance of wave and tidal. And indeed, I had great pleasure in attending with my UK counterpart, Greg Barker, the opening of the Marine Energy Park in the Pentland Firth and Orkney Waters in the summer. And I'm therefore particularly pleased that the review outcome for wave and tidal is extremely positive on both sides of the border, and that the UK is following Scotland's leads in setting higher rock levels at 5 rocks up to a 30 megawatt project cap in respect of a wave and 2 rocks above the cap. What I would say is that the scale and the potential of wave and tidal energy in Scotland is truly immense. The developments which are being contemplated are world-beating. They will be massive projects if they go ahead. They will have huge potential to help sustain and foster job creation in many of the most rural parts of Scotland and islands of Scotland. This is a massive opportunity, and I'm delighted that we have achieved this result together with our UK colleagues to incentivise these particular forms of energy where Scotland has a huge proportion of the potential of both wave and tidal power, not just in Scotland, but indeed the whole of Europe.
Ken McIntosh, to be followed by Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also echo my colleague's broad welcome for much of what's in the Minister's statement today. But can I ask specifically about his proposals for energy from waste, or in other words, incinerators that generate electricity? Rather than reduce I refer him to page 9 of his accompanying booklet, rather than reduce the ROC by 50%, as was initially proposed, the Minister has retained the current level of support. Can I just ask him to either expand on or clarify his intention towards incinerators? He'll be aware of the anxiety many of these proposals create in communities right across Scotland. And without being too parochial, can I ask him, does he support large-scale incineration from waste as proposed in my own constituency of East Renfrewshire? Minister.
I don't think I should express a view. It's not dodging the question about specific projects, because they may come before ministers in respect of planning, and I think that would be... we heard earlier today about the ministerial code, so I adopt those remarks. Let me say in seriousness, though, in response to the question of why is the Scottish Government continuing to support energy from waste incineration under the RO, that the RO has only, in fact, ever supported energy from waste stations which capture and use the heat produced. And this will, of course, remain the case. And the fact that we've decided to do that reflects the responses that we've received on this matter throughout the consultation. And we also bear in mind, as I think Ken McIntosh will appreciate, that without that support, these stations would in fact still be built, but many of them would operate much less efficiently. So for those reasons, we decided to maintain support at the current level of 1 ROC following consultation.
I have many members who are requesting a question of the Minister. Can I ask members to keep their questions brief? And if I could ask the Minister to keep the answers brief, we will hopefully get through everybody. Angus MacDonald, followed by Collier Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I appreciate the Minister is unable to comment on live planning applications. However, he will be aware of my constituency interest in the Grangemouth biomass proposal. Can the Minister expand on the impact of this statement on combined heat and power biomass projects?
Minister.
Well, the member is right that I can't and won't comment on specific proposals which may come before me or my colleagues. I've already explained in my response to Mary Scanlon the general thinking behind our decision on biomass and to put the cap at 10 megawatts. The cap applies, however, for projects which involve producing electricity only, in other words, using the biomass only to generate electricity. It does not apply where there is combined heat and power. Where there is combined heat and power and where that heat can be used for industrial purposes to perhaps assist a large user of heat to defray and reduce its energy bills, I think that that is providing an additional valuable contribution, potentially extremely valuable, especially to those companies that actually have very high bills at present who may seek thereby to reduce them. We intend to hold a brief consultation on the precise details. This is a chance for stakeholders to put final arguments on the size of cap, for example. The 10 megawatt capacity ceiling was in fact based on work conducted for us by Forest Research, North Energy and Zero, that's with an X Energy. And the last thing I'd say, Presiding Officer, to try to follow your admonition, is that this proposal does not put an automatic halt to any project. Generators of any size can still proceed if they can, as they should, capture and use the heat.
Claudia Beamish, followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The statement makes mention of the reduction in ROCs for onshore wind, but does not mention the proposal contained in the banding review to close the band to new projects at or under 5 megawatts from the 1st of April 2013, subject to consultation on page 10. Can I seek clarification from the Minister that small-scale generation will continue to be supported so that there is an incentive for all communities to invest in these technologies, and what technologies are to be included in the consultation and what the timescale is? Thank
Minister.
Well, I'm pleased that there is such a consensus in support of maintaining onshore wind support at point 9, and Claudia Beamish is quite correct to say that there will be closure of the band to new projects at or below 5 megawatts from the 1st April 2013. However, this will be subject to detailed consultation. That consultation paper 2, I hope, will be issued in around October, and I say around October, not in October, because that's slightly different, because we do need to take, with respect, just a little time to make absolutely sure, I think for some of the reasons that she's alluding to, that we get this right, because the overriding reason is we do wish to continue to incentivise support for the smaller projects.
Liam MacArthur, followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I add my thanks for advance sight of the statement and join the general welcome for much of the content. I think the Minister is also right to illustrate the importance of consistency across the UK, but the important flexibility that he is afforded through devolved powers. In section 9 on solar PV, the report refers to the changing picture on PV generation costs, which suggests that these have fallen considerably. I appreciate he's going to go out to further consultation on this, but given his earlier criticisms of the UK Government in terms of its decisions on solar PV, is there any advanced indications he can give the industry as to his early thinking in that regard about his future intentions?
Minister.
Well, solar PV does have potential in Scotland, perhaps not on a commercial scale, but in common with the rest of the UK, solar PV installations have qualified for a band of 2 ROC since 2009, and our proposal had also been that this level of support should be maintained. However, we have also noted the evidence which the UK Government has gathered on the changing picture on PV generation costs, which does suggest that these have fallen considerably and which mean that we need to look again at the ROC banding for this technology. I think it would be reasonable for me to say that when I did make remarks in this chamber before with regard to the decision the UK took to reduce support for solar PV, I think I did so in a moderate way, and I acknowledged at the time that there was a rationale for the decision to reduce that support, albeit the method they chose to implement it was, shall we say, somewhat controversial. But we recognise there was a rationale for that. So, revised proposals for solar PV will form part of a consultation which the Scottish Government will publish this autumn.
Chick Brodie, followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the statement from the Minister. The Minister will be aware of some concern from industry regarding uncertainty in terms of the UK Government support for renewables. Does he agree with me that the Scottish Government, with this statement, is delivering necessary certainty to ensure further investment in Scotland?
Minister.
Well, I believe and I hope that it is recognised across the UK that investor confidence, investor certainty is a sine qua non of developing our renewable sector. And I think this contribution today will further demonstrate the Scottish Government's credentials to providing the necessary support, using the levers within our power to bring forward the developments that can only arise if there is that confidence. And renewable electricity generation in Scotland was nearly 14,000 gigawatt hours. At the end of 2011, there was nearly 5 gigawatts of installed renewables electricity capacity, and statistics show that renewable electricity generation in Scotland was nearly 5 gigawatt hours for the first quarter in 2012, an increase of 45% from quarter one. I mention this because this shows we're already achieving success and we need to move forward to the next stage.
Can I remind members we have very little time. Ian Gray, followed by Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On page 5 of the accompanying document, the document accompanying the statement, it's made clear there that on anaerobic digestion, the Scottish Government intend to consult on the closure of the scheme to such projects below 5 megawatts. In my own constituency, I have an innovative R&D company working in this area and a distillery looking to pilot the use of AD technology. And I wonder if the Minister could just enlarge a little on his reasons for the presumption towards removing them from the scheme.
Minister.
Well, this decision regarding closure of bans to new projects at or below 5 megawatts was taken with regard to the responses that were received, to the consultation. However, this decision is subject to consultation precisely because we want to receive from interested parties representations. I'd be delighted to receive representations either from his constituents' business or from Ian Gray himself, and we will, I undertake, consider them very carefully.
Rob Gibson, followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the continued RO support for onshore wind and a special ban for offshore wind development. Does the Minister agree that this sends a clear signal to communities and developers that development of wind technology improves the efficiency of onshore wind, which in turn is key to building super-efficient offshore wind farms such as Beatrice and MORL near my constituency to make them world leaders?
Minister.
Yes, I do, and I acknowledge Rob Gibson's campaigning in this issue for many decades now, if I may put it thus. And he's quite right to say that we need to bring costs down for offshore wind. I was delighted that Andrew Jameson has been appointed to head up the ORI Catapult. They will be sized with reducing costs, taking forward the work he's already done. This is excellent news. 10 years ago, the largest capacity for a turbine was about 800 kilowatts. Now it's 10 times that. Great progress has been made in efficiency. I've no doubt the costs will further come down, and particularly the expertise of the offshore oil and gas sector, companies like the Wood Group, are of great assistance to us in finding engineering solutions to drive the cost down.
Patrick Harvey.
Intriguing new experience to be able to say, I welcome much of what Fergus Ewing had to say. But can I ask him, how can he argue that a reduction in the banding for energy from waste plants would result in plants being built without a heat element? They'll only be built if they're consented. Shouldn't we at least be reducing the ROC banding for those which consume materials which could be recycled?
Minister.
Well, I welcome the first part of Patrick Harvey's remarks. I think the announcement that the Scottish Government has made today has actually reflected a great deal of concerns, genuine concerns, by a great many people, many out with industry, having nothing to do with industry at all, who are concerned about the environment in their own part of Scotland through mega plants. And it's also reflected the interests of the consultation. As regards whether or not planning consent would be given to any particular plants, that, of course, is a matter on which I should not comment.
James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In terms of how this scheme operates, 10% of the electricity consumption is within Scotland, but 30% of the ROCs are issued in Scotland, and it's a clear example of Scotland and the UK benefiting from a UK electricity market. Can the Minister describe how the scheme would be administered and funded if Scotland were to separate from the UK?
Minister.
I have every confidence that we will operate in conjunction efficiently with our friends south of the border.
Can I offer my apologies to Alec Johnson and to John Wilson? I regret that I was unable to call you. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 4082 in the name of Fergus Ewing on electricity market reform. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speaking button now. And I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to move the motion. Minister, you've got 13 minutes.
Presiding Officer, before I turn to my speech, could I begin by saying that I was sorry to see the departure of Charles Henry as the Minister of Energy, my counterpart in the UK Government. I say that having worked closely with Charles Henry, who has, I think it's fair to say, been a friend of Scotland. He has been assiduous in attending with myself and co-hosting on some occasions important events in Scotland with regard to renewable energy. When I heard the news that he was, as he puts it, retreating to the back benches, too gentlemanly to say whether a jump or a push was involved, I was in Aberdeen, and it's fair to say that his reputation amongst the oil and gas sector was extremely high. So I think it's the first appropriate opportunity I've had just to say that we had an excellent working relationship in Scotland, in London and in Brussels. Presiding Officer, this afternoon I welcome the opportunity to bring the UK Government's proposals to reform the electricity market back to the Scottish Parliament at an important stage in their development. The Scottish Parliament first debated the proposals in January 2011. Much has happened since, including a Department of Energy and Climate Change white paper and a draft UK energy bill to implement these reforms. Throughout, Scottish ministers have worked closely and constructively with our UK counterparts to shape the reforms to ensure they work both for Scotland and the UK. For us, the message is simple. The Scottish energy sector is essential both to our present and future social, environmental, industrial and economic well-being and growth. These reforms will be fundamental to the energy sector, both for Scotland and the rest of the UK. And I think it's accepted on all sides. We must get them right, and we must deliver them together. The scale of generation and transmission investment needed to deliver a sustainable, low-carbon generating future is significant, up to £110 billion, likely to be required by 2020, more than double the current rate of investment. The Electricity Reform EMR programme sets out to address this challenge by incentivising investment in low-carbon generation whilst ensuring security of supply in a cost-effective way. We now know broadly how reforms are intended to operate, so it is right today that members have an opportunity to scrutinise these proposals. Over the past few years, we have seen real and tangible investment confidence in the energy sector in Scotland, and our ambitious renewable energy and climate change targets are playing a key part in creating and sustaining that confidence. The design of our electricity market and regulatory frameworks are also key to investor confidence. That is why we are working closely with our UK counterparts for closer integration of the UK and electricity markets in the years ahead. We must maintain momentum across our energy sector, and to do that we have two priorities: to tackle inequalities in the transmission charging regime and to ensure that electricity market reform proposals work in ways that help us realise our energy potential. On transmission charging, we remain determined to see real, tangible and enduring reductions in the high transmission charges faced by generators in the areas of highest renewable energy resource in Scotland. We are and continue to work on that.
Lord Fraser.
You'll have seen the terms of the Labour amendment in the name of Rhoda Grant. One concern we on this side of the chamber had was that we do not support a socialised system of transmission charging, which we fear would increase the cost to consumers, particularly in remote areas. I wonder if the Minister could assure us that in supporting the Labour amendment, we would not be committing ourselves to that approach.
Fergus Ewing.
Yes, I'm happy to support this evening the Labour amendment, which refers to a fair and equitable system. And a fair and equitable system is one that we are currently working on. So I'm happy to provide an assurance that in so doing, we have since really January this year, put forward a compromise proposal, and we believe there should be a compromise. In other words, to be quite explicit about this, we are no longer advocating the kind of postage stamp socialised charge that originally we were arguing We have moved from that, recognising there should be a compromise, and indeed I'm happy to say to the member that this is a matter upon which we hope to continue to work closely with our Westminster colleagues, a matter which I discussed with Greg Barker on the ferry to Orkney as it happened, and which I know is under active consideration, as Rhoda Grant knows, by people such as Angus Campbell, leader of the Western Isles Council, and his colleagues, the leaders of Orkney and Shetland councils. And I've also worked very closely with Liam MacArthur, with Tavish Scott, with Dr. Alistair Allen, and with all the representatives. We are all determined to find a fair and equitable compromise solution. And on that basis, I very much hope that all parties in this chamber today will be able to support the motion and the amendment, which would send out, I think, a very dignified but nonetheless clear signal that Scotland wishes to go forward together to find that fair solution. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity to clarify those matters for Murdo Fraser. I'll just turn to the detail of the proposals. The reforms will see the existing renewable obligation replaced with a new support mechanism, a contract for difference, to provide long-term price certainty for low-carbon generation. As I've outlined a moment ago, Presiding Officer, the RO is a vital component of our efforts to increase Scotland's renewable electricity production. The Scottish Parliament has exercised devolved power over the RO judiciously, effectively and successfully to create a strong and effective framework of support. We have targeted that support to reflect Scottish priorities, such as our enormous wave and tidal energy potential. Properly designed, we believe that the CFD market mechanism can work to give similar and effective support for renewable technologies and for carbon capture and storage. But let me be clear, the CFD must be at least as effective as the current support framework. It must be at least as capable of delivering new industry capacity as well as new jobs. It must also replicate the discretion, the flexibility in the RO system to target support where it is needed. What in the EMR debate in January 2011, Liam MacArthur summarised as Scottish discretion to capitalise on Scottish strengths. We are some way towards that in the CFD proposals. Scottish ministers will have, I am pleased to say, a statutory role in the forthcoming energy bill that will set out the design, delivery and operation of the contract for difference framework. But more work is needed on how this will operate in practice and how powers similar to those currently held by the Scottish Parliament can be replicated in the decision-making about settling long-term price levels for different types of renewable energy. We're also clear that Scottish ministers must have a statutory role in the ongoing monitoring and governance arrangements for the body that will deliver the CFD, that is, of course, the national grid. There's more work to do with our UK counterparts here, but we shall continue to work with the UK Government to ensure that our role in each is clear and enduring. And, of course, we are clear that our support for the proposals is contingent upon a proper role for Scottish ministers and the Scottish Parliament in these new arrangements. The other parts of the EMR propose a UK-wide emissions performance standard to cap emissions from unabated fossil fuel plant. While discussions on the detail are ongoing, we are minded to support UK-wide application of the emissions performance standard at the level set out in the bill, namely 450 grams per kilowatt-hour. Again, here, there is more work to do with the UK Government to properly reflect our devolved powers in relation to the application, enforcement and monitoring of the EPS and to ensure the powers of this Parliament are fully and fairly respected in the forthcoming UK Energy Bill legislation. The reforms propose a capacity market during the transition to a low-carbon generating mix by incentivising short-run plant which can come on supply quickly to generate and maintain security of supply and accommodate increased renewable energy on the grid. There is more work to do to understand how this will operate for gas generators in Scotland, whilst encouraging demand-side response in areas where Scotland has strengths, such as pump storage hydro. But as well as positives in the EMR, there are some concerns. Industry leaders have made it clear that to make investment decisions, they do need clarity and certainty on support from the government. At one level, there are arguments that the electricity market reform process has created delays, confusion and uncertainty. SSE has described the EMR as too complex, they are unworkable. Scottish Power, RWE and others suggest we are seeing an investment hiatus because of uncertainty. The Westminster Energy and Climate Change Select Committee, chaired by Tim Yeo, have been critical on the workability and legality of some of the proposals. The Scottish Government also has some concerns that there is at present the possibility that EMR may deliver subsidy support for new nuclear, possibly at the expense of renewables in Scotland. The Scottish Government position on new build nuclear power remains clear. We do not propose nor favour new nuclear power stations. Major questions exist about the levels of EMR support which may be given to new nuclear build, and there must be more transparency in these support negotiations. The Westminster Select Committee has echoed these concerns, Presiding Officer, saying that proposed process for settling the nuclear strike prices lacks sufficient transparency and could be highly damaging to the low-carbon agenda and undermine consumer trust in energy companies. One possible consequence of the levy control framework within which HM Treasury is pressing deck to deliver the EMR is that new nuclear projects could absorb a significant amount of the overall levy control framework budget at the expense of renewables. We are concerned, Presiding Officer, to ensure that there remains sufficient incentivisation for renewables. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, these proposals have significant implications for our energy sector and for the devolved powers of this Parliament. There are significant opportunities for Scotland, but also significant challenges. EMR must deliver, both for Scotland and the rest of the UK, a system that doesn't undermine the huge progress we have made to date, a system that supports our ambitions, a system that delivers support to the technologies of the future, and for our part, Scottish ministers will work ceaselessly to help achieve that and work constructively with the UK Government in order to ensure that the proposed reforms support our renewable energy and climate change targets and priorities. Presiding Officer, I urge the Parliament to support us in this vital work. I move the motion in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Rhoda Grant to speak to and move Amendment 4082.1. Up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start by associating myself with the comments that Fergus Ewing made about Charles Henry? I've certainly heard those repeated elsewhere and have no difficulty in associating myself with them. Can I also welcome this debate on electricity market reform? The driver behind the reform is to provide electricity supply that is secure, affordable and low carbon. And EMR has been an ongoing process for some time, and it's of crucial importance to Scotland and indeed our renewable industry. And stakeholders need certainty around the proposal so that they can have confidence in the funding structures in order that they can make progress with development plans. While supporting the Government's motion, we have amended it to add emphasis to a couple of issues: grid connection charging for our islands and the impact of the energy market reform on fuel poverty. In Scotland, we have targets to eradicate fuel poverty by 2016, and the Scottish Government have obligations to meet those targets. But energy market reform also has a part to play. Currently, the electricity market is dominated by the Big Six. Market domination is never healthy, and their hold over it extends from generation to transmission and indeed to sale, and it makes it very difficult for new entrants to come into the market. Choice is important to those who are suffering fuel poverty in order that they can access cheaper electricity. Encouraging new entrants could mean that providers, such as social enterprises, who could target fuel poverty can enter the market. And we need to use this opportunity to encourage community generators and not-for-profit organisations into the market, because the current market works against those who suffer fuel poverty. Companies also offer things like dual fuel discounts, but they're not open to people who are off-gas grid. And off-gas grid areas are often the very places where fuel poverty is most prevalent. Neither are those in fuel poverty able to access cheaper online tariffs or discounts if you pay by direct debit. And WWF, in their briefing for this debate, talked about demand reduction as well. But this isn't included in the energy bill. And however, they point out that a bill designed to address the electricity market is incomplete if it only focuses on supply and pays no attention to demand. Demand reduction is crucial to fighting fuel poverty. We know that energy prices will continue to rise. Therefore, to tackle fuel poverty, we need to reduce consumption. And we need to address these issues under energy market reform. Can I turn to grid connection charges, which is the other issue in our amendment? And the proposed pricing structure has been proposed in Project Transmit. And it's been largely welcomed because it's an awful lot fairer to renewable generation and indeed to Scotland. However, there are still huge problems with the proposed grid access charges to our islands. And I can confirm to Murdo Fraser what our amendment is not asking for socialised charges. What we're asking for is fair access for our islands, because our islands have the potential to become the renewable generators for the whole country. Wind speeds are higher, so onshore wind is much more productive. We've got one of the largest wind farm developments planned in Shetland, and it's a joint project between the Community Trust and SSE. It provides the opportunity to boost the local economy for many, many years to come, but it will be disadvantaged if grid connection charges are much higher. In Orkney, Yes?
Mary Scanlon.
Yes, would a member also agree that Ofgem have not yet reached a conclusion following their consultation on the grid connection charges for the islands, and this is most likely to come out towards the end of this year, but maybe next year?
Rhoda Grant.
Indeed, and that is really the reason that we have tried to incorporate that in this debate, because I think it would be helpful if we as a whole Parliament could send a strong message to Ofgem about those charges so that they would look for a solution to the problem. I don't pretend that it's easy to find a solution to those problems, but I think if we can send a united message, they may work together to find that for us. Another area where we have islands that would benefit from better charging regime is in Orkney, where we have the world-leading wave and tidal research and development centre. And that centre allows prototype devices to actually generate electricity to the grid now. Orkney also sits beside the Pentland Firth, Scotland's first marine energy park. And if they are to capitalise on both on and offshore generation, we need fair grid connection charges. If it's markedly cheaper to take marine energy onshore in the mainland, then it's likely that Orkney will lose out. And there could also be a problem for Caithness in that it could become overpressurised by substation development. The Western Isles have the potential to turn around their economy with both on and offshore renewables. However, if the connection charges are too high, they're likely to lose out on that benefit as well. The area has the potential to be the best site for wave and tidal power, and therefore to stall that development could actually impact on the whole country. Now, as I've pointed out, islands really stand to generate more, and we need the Westminster Government to address the charges, but we maybe also need to look at rock banding because of the importance of these island generators, and that's something I've already written to the Minister for, and I hope that he will keep this under review. Because if we don't sort out the grid charging for islands, it will mean a delay to the upgrade of those grids to the islands. And we see cable prices rising very quickly. So any delay actually means an even higher cost and a higher cost. So not only are projects stalling because they can't get grid connection, it will mean a further expense in the future. And there are similar delays elsewhere due to poor infrastructure in our rural areas. And we need to increase the pace of grid improvement to make sure that development is not stalled. Because security of supply is a driving force in energy market reform. And much of our generation is old and our transmission systems are creaking. To move to low-carbon generation means that generation occurs where there are low-carbon resources, such as renewables. And the role of the grid previously had largely been to move high capacities within urban areas. And this has changed markedly, as it now requires to carry high loads from reasonably remote areas that previously had required very little capacity. And I've often heard it said that a rural grid system is very much like a piece of wet string, so therefore it needs massive investment to upgrade the grid, and that is part of the intention behind electricity market reform. One of the other main intentions behind reform is to reduce carbon from our electricity production. And indeed, most of our generators are old, and we need to replace that. And there is no point in replacing like by like, because that doesn't cut our carbon outputs. And we need to use the new system, contracts for a difference, to make that step change. And I think everybody welcomes contracts for a difference. The trouble is the devil is in the detail, and we don't have the detail. There are concerns that those contracts will be auctioned and that tested forms of low-carbon generation will beat the more expensive forms of renewables that are only in development now. The plea from the generators is market stability. Both the UK and Scottish governments can give clear statements about the future support that will be available to renewables in order that developers can have confidence to move forward. And I think it's very good that we're sending a clear statement from this Parliament, because it also needs buy-in from other political parties, so that security will continue regardless of changes of government in the future. I very much applaud the aims behind energy market reform, ensuring that we have secure, low-carbon, affordable electricity. And I believe that that is something we can unite behind, and I move the amendment in my name.
Many, many thanks. Now call on Mary Scanlon. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank the Minister for his kind words for Charles Henry? I'm sure he will appreciate that. And I do hope and trust that the partnership with the new Minister will continue. We will be supporting the Labour amendment today, given the Minister's assurances. You will understand our apprehensions. We had an Energy Act last year which resulted in better opportunities to compare prices. We had the Green Deal and the Green Investment Bank based in Edinburgh and more. This Westminster Bill on electricity market reform is undoubtedly complex and technical, and it will take considerable scrutiny by the Westminster Select Committee, and it's right that this Parliament plays its part in scrutinising the bill. I would also like to thank our Minister for Energy for his constructive approach to this debate and indeed to this bill. I regret that the joint briefing with his Westminster colleague scheduled for Monday this week was cancelled due to the reshuffle down south. But partnership working has been good between Scotland and Westminster, and I trust it will continue. The letter from the First Minister in response to the UK Energy Bill states that electricity market reforms are crucial to Scotland's future energy mix, and that the Scottish Government agrees with the principles underpinning the reform. I particularly acknowledge the First Minister's comments, and I quote, that these reforms build on the success we have achieved to date through the effective use of our existing powers and in increasingly productive, proactive and valuable alignments of political and policy will with industry and investor effort. I think this is undoubtedly how devolution was intended. There's also a very welcome approach on price certainty and, as the Minister stated, the statutory requirement to consult Scottish ministers, rightly so, in the design and delivery of the contracts for difference, which we fully welcome. Although there is much work to be done in the bill, it is refreshing and very encouraging to hear the Scottish Government working so positively with Westminster. The domination of the UK electricity market by the Big Six, as Rhoda Grant mentioned, with only 2 companies based here, does give rise to concern, particularly given the vertical integration from generation through to supply. One MP described this process as allowing a utility company to generate the electricity under one arm of the company, sell it through an intermediary, often offshore, which they also own, and then on-sell it to another arm of the corporation, which supplies it to us as the consumer. This results in a total lack of transparency in the true cost of electricity and prevents real competition and, as Rhoda Grant also said, a barrier to new entrants. This bill has an opportunity to address these issues. There was one issue that wasn't in the bill that I would like to raise today and perhaps ask the Minister if this is something that has been discussed, and it's the issue of electricity storage. And given the vertical integration of these big 6 companies, I would hope that they may be looking at electricity storage, as suggested by the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in a paper they presented in Parliament this week. Given that power systems must be operated so that supply is equal to real-time demand and system losses at all times, it makes sense to look more carefully at electricity storage, particularly given the intermittent nature of wind power. This would also increase the efficient utilisation of these assets and other assets on the network. I understand that these storage systems can be installed at a community level as well as the grid. The Mechanical Engineers report suggests an urgent, detailed analysis on electricity storage be done, and I would ask the Minister if that's something that has been discussed with his Westminster counterparts. But not only have the Westminster Select Committee been critical of the complexity of this bill, but Ian Marchant, the Chief Executive of SSE, stated in evidence at Westminster that the legislation is an exercise in job creation for lawyers and economists. I just hope that the bill will bring the clarity and transparency out of the current complexity, which is much needed. There are many positive features of the bill, including the desire to keep household energy bills as low as possible. Ofgem's work to make the markets as simple and as fair as possible will be ongoing, and it's believed that the result of the EMR will be a 4.3 decrease in domestic energy between 2016 and 30. I'm also pleased to note that the bill reflects the UK Government's ambition to shift future energy generation away from large fossil-fuelled power stations towards a more balanced range of energy production methods. And of course, on this side of the House, we would not be ruling out nuclear as one of those options. This is to be achieved through a range of measures, which I'm sure will be examined in the fullness of time. So, Presiding Officer, in summary, we are in favour of this bill, although it is highly complex and we are still waiting to see it in its final form. Its commitment to reducing carbon emissions, securing energy supply and cost effectiveness are all measures of which I'm sure everyone will approve. These are measures which are absolute necessities, and it's very good to hear that both the Scottish and Westminster governments are committed to working together on this very important issue.
Many thanks. We now move to open debate, and I call on John Wilson to be followed by Claudia Beamish. We are tight for time today, so up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the motion in the name of the Minister Fergus Ewing and the debate initiated in the name of the Scottish Government. I trust that today's debate on electricity market reform will assist in increasing the pace of the reforms in the electricity market, especially since the Scottish Government has placed the low-carbon economy at the heart of its economic strategy. In terms of commenting on the UK Government draft Energy Bill objectives, it places a significant element on security of supply with regard to electricity and increasing investment. At this point, it would be remiss of me not to put on record my real concerns about how the consumer has not been best served so far in the current marketplace for electricity. The consumer should be at the heart of any reform process, not viewed as an inconvenient afterthought in the process. In the period from 2006 to 2011, there was an increase of 54.9% in electricity bills for the consumer. This has resulted in many people having to make tough decisions as to how they spend their money in these most difficult times. Any future policies must ensure that the issue of fuel poverty is tackled. In looking at the details as proposed in the Energy Bill, then I do have concerns with regard to the mechanism for contract for difference. This seems to me akin to the kind of financial derivatives that were used in the mortgage market. It could be argued that this type of financial engineering might not exactly be the best approach to be adopted. There is a need for clarification on this proposed mechanism, especially when the whole purpose is to provide price certainty and vital investment. In terms of growing a low-carbon economy, then there is more we can all do as individuals, energy companies, and also what the government can deliver in terms of its policy focus. The electricity market reform forms a vital part of the development of a low-carbon economic strategy that will aim to make Scotland more capable of resisting the volatility associated with ever-increasing energy prices. Growth that is sustainable in the long term is vitally important in terms of taking our country forward. A robust electricity market should be part of that sustainable and growing future. Of course, the future of Scotland's energy needs should not include new nuclear generation as part of the energy mix. While the UK Government continues to believe that nuclear power is a financially viable option, despite the current decommissioning costs and financial subsidy demanded by the nuclear industry at present. This is an opportune debate with regard to Scotland having an increasing role on the global stage, given that as a country we have the potential to produce a quarter of Europe's offshore and wind energy potential. The prospects for Scotland's economy are dependent on utilising renewables, particularly when we put it in context that the global low-carbon economy is forecast to grow to £4.3 trillion by the year 2015. As I have stated previously in this chamber, Scotland is constrained under the current devolved settlement. This is even more apparent in terms of the issues of transmission charges regime that currently exist. The present charging system does discriminate against the Scottish interest, and this is very apparent when it comes to paying through the nose when currently connecting to the UK national grid, as explained earlier by other speakers. I am hopeful that principles contained in the UK Energy Bill will better signpost a future of increased investment by developing the principle of a capacity market in respect of delivering generating capacity. This will help ensure that companies will have sufficient capacity to focus their attention on growing the market and the economy. Associated with this development is the substantive aim of making Scotland a leading centre of low-carbon investment. I am optimistic that other companies will follow this example of Samsung Heavy Industries and will continue to invest in Scotland. Today's debate is timely, and I look hopefully forward to many of the issues discussed this afternoon being taken forward in the coming months and years, and that both the UK and Scottish governments can develop a reform agenda in the electricity marketplace programme that ensures real benefits for the people of Scotland, and that Scotland can play a major role in Europe in becoming a powerhouse for future energy production. Presiding Officer, I will be supporting the amendment lodged in the name of Rhoda Grant today because I think it is very important that we actually look at the connection costs for the grid, particularly in our Highlands and Islands communities, but in particular the fuel poverty issue, because we cannot have a continued policy that sees electricity prices rise at a time when household budgets are decreasing. Therefore, fuel poverty should be at the heart of any energy strategy that's taken forward either by the Scottish Government or the UK Government. And I will be supporting both the motion and the amendment this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Claudia Beamish to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I first just associate myself with the remarks of the previous speaker in relation to fuel poverty, which is perhaps one of the most important issues of our time that we can resolve within this Parliament, and therefore I'm very pleased to be supporting our motion today in the name of Rhoda Grant. The UK Government's electricity market reform proposals set out some important aspects of the context in which we shape our generation, transmission and distribution and supply of electricity. And I'm eager to speak in the debate to highlight some positives, but also, I hope, to help expose some of the areas that remain of concern. It is, of course, essential that a clear sense of direction, as other speakers have highlighted, is laid out to enable some certainty for the future of the electricity market. However, questions still need to be addressed and issues must be tackled if we are to move forward in a fair, inclusive direction towards a low-carbon economy. Climate change is the biggest long-term challenge we face, and EMR must set the context for moving forward fairly in the quest for targets under the Act. Is there healthy competition in the market? The Big Six are indeed vertically integrated companies, and on the supply side, they provide energy to 99% of all domestic consumers. This surely cannot be right. As highlighted by Rhoda Grant and Mary Scanlon, no new entrant has ever reached the critical mass to break through past the Big Six. Are consumer electricity prices fair as they possibly can be to customers? There are many who think not, and I agree with them. An Institute for Public Policy Research report argues that Ofgem, and I quote, should enforce its existing policy that suppliers must offer tariffs that reflect their costs more robustly. The report also highlights how the Big Six can overcharge their less price-sensitive customers in order to offer heavy discounts to others, discounts which new entrants and smaller suppliers struggle to match, thereby reducing competition again in the market. The cooperative electricity supplier, which I want to highlight being a member of the parliamentary group, which offers a simple single tariff to consumers, is a good example of the challenge faced by new entrants. Is there an over-centralisation in the market? Large-scale renewable generation is essential, as I believe we agree across the chamber, of course, both on and offshore to meet our obligations under the Climate Change Act and to move to a low-carbon economy. There are concerns by Scottish Renewable that the auction process under contracts for difference, as they highlighted in their report and brief for this debate, may harm renewables in general and especially Scotland's nascent marine renewable energy technologies, as it would be unable to compete with other low-carbon technologies which have been established longer. While recognising that there have been concerns about onshore wind by some rural communities, the revised SNH cumulative effect guidelines must address some of these concerns, and the Community Benefit Register by the Scottish Government will must lead to a more transparent system of community benefit. Where communities and cooperatives are making applications or joint applications with companies, there is often a different perception of what some communities who object to applications from to that of some communities who object to applications, from large companies. It also needs acknowledging that there is waste through the unused heat and also the transmission losses highlighted by Rhoda Grant. EMR sets the structures within which the Big Six can operate vertically, but does it really do justice to the opportunities to facilitate localism and decentralised energy generation? The answer, disappointingly, is no. Many communities across Scotland are wanting to take the power into their own hands, and the Climate Challenge Fund has helped with this. On the Race Committee, with other members in the chamber today, I visited Gia and saw the benefits of community ownership for myself. The benefits both financially and socially are highlighted also by many other communities in Scotland, such as Fintry. Sarah Boyack has also worked hard, as acknowledged by other members this afternoon, to facilitate the micro-generation movement, along with others. But the pleas of Friends of the Earth, WWF and others to the UK government to, and I quote Friends of the Earth, use the opportunity of EMR to break up the stranglehold of the Big Six has been largely ignored in all aspects of electricity supply and generation. Do the current proposals for reform of the electricity market address demand reduction? In 211, Friends of the Earth stated in its consultation response to the UK government, the government needs to ensure that EMR puts reducing electricity demand on a par with generating more power. Friends of the Earth has also stressed that an overall demand reduction target should have been set. This has not happened, nor does EMR create a robust framework for smart technology, nor does it make any significant contribution to addressing fuel poverty, in my view. Further, the UK's Green Deal, which runs parallel with EMR, while welcome in the context of demand reduction, fails to address the challenges of improving hard-to-heat homes. There are essential issues that can also be tackled in Scotland in relation to fuel poverty, especially given the latest shocking statistics which estimate that 800,000 Scots, almost a third of all households, are now living in fuel poverty. This is where the Scottish Government and those of us across the Parliament who are united in tackling fuel poverty has a responsibility now to make a difference. And Scotland has a unique combination of issues which will lead to higher levels of fuel poverty, have led to higher levels of fuel poverty, colder winters, more houses built from stone and difficult to heat, and issues in rural areas with no mains gas, which force consumers into buying whatever is locally available, usually from the Big Six. These issues all must be taken into account if any reform of the electricity market in the UK is successful, and if it is to be fairly implemented in Scotland for consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Presiding officer, I, unlike Charles Henry, am definitely not a retreatee. I very much welcome the opportunity to engage in a wider range of subjects. Let me start by saying electricity market reform is both necessary and urgent. For Scotland, a reformed market in these islands and across Europe must create the conditions for the creation of the physical and economic infrastructure that allows the export of a key product from our fastest growing 21st century industry, renewable energy. History tells us that economic development is driven by access to energy. Over the last few hundred years, that has been, most importantly for us, access to coal and oil. And, of course, an education system that gave us the engineers to drive forward new industries based on access to energy. Some of this ain't new. The first wind turbines were in operation in 200 BC. And the first wind turbine in the world to generate electricity was installed in Marykirk by the Scottish academic James Blythe in July 1887, 135 years ago. But unlike the previous source of energy upon which we relied, modern renewable energy is kind to the environment. We now have power generation where the environmental costs are exceeded by the benefits. No particulate pollution inhaled by workers and residents. No oxides of sulphur and nitrogen to damage lungs and plants. No CO2 to warm the planet. But investment in power generation is investment for the long term. Therefore, investors need long-term confidence about the fiscal environment within which they will operate. They cannot easily transfer generating equipment to another part of the world if the government changes the rules. Quite different from other manufacturing industries. Manufacturing power is locked to local sites. It gives us long-term economic benefit if we provide long-term certainty. The passage of the Climate Change Act in 2009 with unanimity in this Parliament is one of the underpinnings that has given the renewables industry the confidence to invest. Whatever the political vicissitudes which may affect any party in a democracy, whatever the nature of future governments in Scotland, we made that shared commitment which others now rely on and from which our economy gains. We can already see the effect of reneging on deals. The Kyoto Protocol represented an international agreement to essentially create a carbon market so that the environmental cost of human activity would carry an associated economic cost. When the United States recoiled from its international obligations under Kyoto, the international market in carbon all but collapsed. The European Emissions Trading Scheme has taken up some of the slack, but for a number of EU countries, notably Poland, the loss of Kyoto revenue, not unreasonably, makes it difficult to strengthen targets in Europe while others turn their back on duty. Indeed, I was leading the UK delegation in Durban for the 17th Conference of the Parties meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change when the United States came to speak to plenary. Such was the hostility to the United States delegate that he had to shorten his speech and leave the podium much earlier than anticipated. When you sacrifice long-term necessities by trimming to short-term needs, you sacrifice trust. Trust built in a life, sacrificed in a second. So I very much welcome the positive collaboration between the Scottish and Westminster governments on this agenda, and indeed the international engagement our ministers are having with countries across Europe. So what are my personal tests to measure success in EMR? Firstly, consensus across jurisdictions and political parties, long-term stability. Second, equal access to networks, a point usefully highlighted by the Labour amendment today, supporting community and industrial-scale generation. Thirdly, progressing the carbon reduction agenda and supporting the Climate Change Acts in Scotland and at Westminster, saving the planet. Fourthly, delivering affordable energy, tackling fuel poverty. John Wilson, Rhoda Grant have mentioned. Fifthly, building our economy, gaining a reward for effort. But there are signs of difficulty. Westminster has an unhealthy focus on gas. Yes, the CO2 from gas generation of power is much less than from coal, but without carbon capture and storage, the emissions remain too high. John Selwyn-Gummer, now Lord Debden, chairs UK Climate Change Committee. His committee have just written to the Westminster Government to make clear that a focus on gas is a focus on climate failure. Let's hope he maintains close relations with his political colleagues and gets that message across. Carbon capture and storage is not the long-term answer. We have to do more, but it can deliver substantial intermediate-term benefits. Now, China is not normally regarded as a climate champion, but it's already building better wind turbines by using its access to rare earths for better magnets. In my constituency, we're ready to follow their lead. They have 7 carbon capture plants already operational. Martina Navratilova once said, "It's not how I play when I'm at my best that means I win. It's how I play when I'm at my worst that makes me a champion." On the climate agenda, it's similarly how we respond when the economic, social and environmental challenge is at its greatest that will determine our success or failure to combat global warming. I'm very happy to support the Government and the Labour Party's motions before us today.
Many, many thanks. I now call on Kevin Stewart to be followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all echo the many kind words that have been said about Charles Henry in the Chamber today. As an Aberdeen MSP, I've come across Mr Henry, and I know how high a regard he is held in the oil and gas industry. The only thing that I would say is it's a great pity that when you actually find a good energy minister, and they've been few and far between in my mind, that they disappear quite quickly in the revolving door that is seems to be at deck for energy ministers. Presiding Officer, can I thank those organisations that have taken the trouble to provide MSPs with briefings today, and can I say that I am really quite happy that in this process that there will be a statutory role for Scottish ministers and that the Scottish Government will be a partner rather than a consultee. That is a breakthrough, although I would rather that we controlled all of this in this Parliament. I think it is extremely important to draw attention to part of the parliamentary briefing that was provided by WWF Scotland and their words around about nuclear. And I'm going to make no apology for reading that section of the document, Presiding Officer. It says, WWF believes the energy bill risks distorting the investment environment towards nuclear at the expense of renewables. Recent developments in the UK's nuclear market suggest that it is extremely unlikely that much nuclear capacity will be built in the UK over the next 20 years. This is exemplified by the recent withdrawal by E.ON and RWE from the UK's Horizon joint venture and the doubling of construction costs of building reactors in France and Finland, both of which are between 4 and 5 years behind schedule. The effect of the current package of reforms could be an energy bill that falls short of providing the framework for renewables, and yet nuclear still doesn't move forward due to spiralling costs. A lose-lose situation. and I agree with WWF Scotland. And beyond their words, we have seen in other parts of the world a move away from nuclear technology. We are seeing that in Japan, we are seeing that in Germany. And I hope, maybe beyond hope in fact, that the UK government does not gamble with nuclear at the expense of the renewables industries that we actually want to see develop, which we can be at the forefront of. Yeah,
Fraser.
I'm very grateful for Mr Stewart giving way. I wonder if, in addition to the submission from WWF Scotland, he also read the submission from EDF Energy, where they say companies such as EDF Energy are planning to build forward investment in new nuclear build, including also renewables and high-efficiency gas through CCGT. So perhaps the situation is not as bleak as Mr Stewart would paint.
I actually haven't seen EDF's submission. They must have missed me out in terms of their briefing. Maybe knowing my views, I don't know. No, I disagree with you, and I think that it's going to be increasingly more difficult unless we have that huge degree of subsidy for anyone to enter the nuclear market. And I hope that that subsidy it does not exist. I really do believe that we should be at the forefront of renewables and should be forgetting technologies like nuclear. Like many others in the chamber today, fuel poverty is a major issue in my constituency, as it is everywhere else. And I really do think that at the forefront of this, we should be minimising the costs to consumers. And I hope that we can achieve that in this reform that is going ahead. I also agree with the speakers that have talked about the transmission regime, charging regime, because at the end of the day, in order for our island communities to take full advantage of their position, that needs to be changed. Ms Grant mentioned the Shetland wind farm development, and I, in a recent visit by the local government committee, seen the site for that development, and I hope that that can go ahead and that there will be reasonable transmission charging so that Shetland can benefit to the great degree that it should. Presiding officer, I think that we have in our Energy Minister, Fergus Ewing, someone who will have the ability, I'm sure, to bring these matters forward with the Westminster Government. I know that he is no patsy, and I'm sure that he will ensure that Scotland's best interests are at heart during the discussions that he will have round about electricity market reform. I support the motion. I support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on James Kelly to be followed by Gil Patterson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this afternoon's debate on electricity market reform. A number of speakers have spoken about the complexity of the reforms, but I actually do think this is an important debate for two reasons. Electricity and energy policy affects people's lives, and also it cuts across a number of the portfolio areas that we look at in this Parliament. If you look at the challenges for successful electricity market reform, it's about keeping the lights on, it's about reducing carbon emissions, tackling fuel poverty, using energy as a source to boost and to grow the economy. And there are also serious questions about how energy policy would operate in an independent Scotland. I think one of the key issues clearly is security of supply, and I think it's a fact that at this minute in time we operate a mixed energy policy, particularly in Scotland, and I think some of the SNP speakers have turned a blind eye to the fact that 30% of the generation of electricity comes from nuclear sources. And it's been interesting to see the SNP journey since 2007, where they very much set their face against nuclear power. they accepted it when they came into power, and we've seen extensions to existing nuclear stations quite readily accepted by SNP ministers. In fact, recently Mr Ewing was at Hunterston to open the new visitor centre. And I think that's just an acceptance of the reality that certainly in the current make-up we need nuclear in order to support the base load. I think, yes, I will give way.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would Mr Kelly accept that the costs of nuclear generation are so prohibitive that the investment in the decommissioning of plants at the present moment by the UK government, which is over £3 billion, if invested in renewables, would safeguard the renewables industry and the country from potential contamination from nuclear waste?
James Kelly.
I think Mr Wilson makes a pertinent point in terms of costs, because I think that any model for electricity generation going forward must be cost-based. Ahead of today's debate, and some of them were exchanged in the previous speaker, we've been bombarded with different briefings, quoting different costs, and I'm not going to endorse any of those at this time, but I think that what we do need to do is we need to flush out the costs related to each source of generation in order to be able to establish how we move forward. The SNP have set a target of 100% of electricity to be delivered in Scotland by renewable sources by 2020, but we're already seeing that there are reports that there are 53 objections to applications in the planning process, and Perth and Kinross Council saying that it's costing them £1 million to deal with applications. So there's a concern there that even under, I'm sorry, I want to make progress, even under renewables, the progress is perhaps not as fast as the SNP government would like. And I think we need a realistic cost-based model. And the reason I say that is not to be boring or dogmatic, is because the costs then pass on to the consumer. And the Labour amendment makes a very important point about fuel poverty. We see many people in Scotland, including pensioners, suffering under fuel poverty. And we've got to get the model right so that we can deliver as low cost electricity as possible to consumers. I give way to Margot MacDonald.
Margot MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Thank the member also. Do you imply that the fuel poverty being experienced just now in families in Scotland is not the fault in any way of the energy supplying companies?
James Kelly.
No, I'm certainly not implying that, Margaret MacDonald. You misunderstand me if you think that. Clearly, if you look at the profits of some of those companies and you look at what people are having to endure in terms of bills, it's unacceptable that those profits should rocket while people suffer in hardship throughout Scotland and throughout the rest of the UK. I think the final point I want to make in my contribution is there are important issues, as I said earlier, for the SNP as to how energy policy would operate if we did separate from the rest of the UK. We currently consume 10% of electricity, but 30% of the ROC certificates are issued in Scotland. And moving to a separate Scotland, it is clear that there would be a cost. Some reports have quoted a cost of £4 billion. And what government ministers would have to do in that case is they'd have to decide whether they passed the costs on to business and on to consumers, or whether they took the money out of the Scottish budget. And I think there are real issues to examine as we move forward to debate the issue of separation from the rest of the UK. And summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, there's no doubt that what's been proposed is a complex area, but it's important that those proposals are brought forward and they serve the consumer at heart in order that, as Margaret MacDonald pointed out, we can deliver bills that are realistic to electricity customers throughout Scotland and the UK.
Thank you very much. Kilpaterson, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I think this debate comes at a very important time and is very much welcomed. When discussing matters relating to energy, there tends to be a lot of focus on how the energy is produced and distributed rather than how it impacts on ordinary persons. During this speech, I will attempt to focus on both the production of electricity and how the general population is affected. When we look at how we produce electricity, it should be based on a model that is both safe and help deliver the climate targets set by the Scottish Government. Indeed, with no country being able to avoid the effects of climate change, the world as a whole has an interest in debating such matters as we are. In the relatively short period of time of a devolved Scotland, we have taken a leading role in tackling climate change. This has not gone unnoticed in other countries, and we must continue to be an example. That is why I am delighted of the support given by the Scottish Government to the renewable energy sector. It has been said before countless times, but it is important to continue to highlight Scotland is in a unique situation of having an abundance of energy resources, from tidal to wind to marine. We must ensure that we maximise these resources so that future generations can benefit. That's why the decisions we make as a Parliament and a country are so fundamentally important. The next generation of Scots rely on us. The future is in renewables, and investment should continue to be directed to support that industry, an industry that ensures that both jobs come to Scotland and therefore a twin priority. I share the concerns of the Scottish Government that nuclear power, however, may be subsidised by the general public. This is the wrong approach to take, especially if the subsidy harms investment for the renewable energy sector in Scotland, which is growing at the present time, bringing with it local investment and jobs in very hard-hit areas. We have a duty to ensure that the hard work and investment already delivered by renewables is not harmed. There has been a lot said about nuclear power, not only in the Chamber, but across Scotland and the rest of the world. The issues regarding nuclear waste are well documented. But my concerns lie particularly with the danger of human error. Who would ever imagine that Japan, arguably the world's most technologically equipped nation, would forget to simply protect the generators and pumps from tsunami? Even more alarming, this is a country with 2,000 years of written history and experience in dealing with tsunami. The lessons being, the law of averages say human error will happen. Therefore, nuclear should not be an option. With regards to the electricity market reform proposals put forward by the British Government, I applaud the sentiments and the ambition. And whilst I may be critical of some elements of the proposals, I believe it is too important to allow party political allegiances to undermine the whole process. That being said, there are further areas of concern that need to be addressed by the British Government before we can move forward. The complexity of the reforms is one of the main concerns, with fear amongst the industry that investment may decrease as investors are scared off by the proposals. Indeed, even the Westminster Select Committee on Energy and Climate Change has voiced these concerns in its report on the proposals, even going so far as to say that the consumer, i.e. the ordinary people, will not benefit from these proposals. As the economic downturn continues to impact on the people, we must do everything in our power to alleviate the suffering. The rising costs of electricity have a detrimental impact on the budgets of families and individuals, and I share my concerns with other members across the Chamber on the possibilities of fuel poverty actually impacting even further. As we leave a summer where there was little cheer on the economic front for families, we now approach the time of year where household bills will indeed increase. Families and individuals, especially the elderly, will be forced into making a choice over their welfare. Certainly.
Mary Scanlon. Thank you. I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Although there's still a way to go, would you welcome the work that Ofgem has done in providing tariff simplification, clearer comparisons between energy companies to make it more easy to switch supplier, and also the fixed standing charges which are being set by them?
Gil Patterson, and you have 30 seconds to come to conclusion.
Yeah, certainly. I do welcome that, but I say it through gritted teeth. I don't really hold Ofgem as a model for controlling the way that energy impacts on people who really need their assistance. And I think they've been very mute and not very effective in the past. That's my view on these matters. Can I just finish, Presiding Officer, by recommending to the Chamber that they support this motion and the Labour amendment. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think the generous remarks from the Minister in relation to Charles Henry and the tone of his speech are indicative of the approach he's taken since taking on the energy brief. I think he has been assiduous in trying to work across parties and with ministerial colleagues at Westminster. I certainly welcome that. I think it reflects the need to de-risk, in a political sense, this whole process. And as he said earlier today, the value stakeholders place on as much consistency as possible across the UK. I think, who knows, 12 months from now, if he's still in the energy brief, we may be able to coax him off the rocks of the separatist agenda of some of his colleagues, epitomised by the siren-in-chief, Kevin Stewart. But the government motion reflects the general support, I think, for the underlying principles of EMR. I think Stuart Stevenson very well set out the context for this. Over the next decade, 20% of existing power generation is likely to come offline. As we look to decarbonise the transport system and heat, our demand could double by 2050. So without reform, I think there's a very serious risk of blackouts, a reliance on expensive imports. But that reform can also, I think, attract and lever in over £100 billion of investment. This will not be easy, I think, particularly given the timeframes we're looking at. And I think the fact that the UK Government have gone out to pre-legislative scrutiny is an important and unwelcome step on their part. E.ON in their briefing call for, quote, clarity, urgency, stability and simplicity, given that this, I think, EMR reminds many of the Schleswig-Holstein question. This may be easier said than done, but those are features that I think are necessary to unlock the investment. Appropriate infrastructure and an appropriate charging regime is also key, and I think Rhoda Grant and her amendment very ably sum up that need and the importance of this. The islands, such as those I represent, are critical not just to Scotland but to the UK achieving our renewables objectives. I will indeed.
Margot MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With regard to the Schleswig-Holstein question, I've forgotten what it is.
Liam MacArthur.
There is three people that understand it. One is dead, one is mad, and one cannot be bothered explaining it. But Orkney is at the centre of marine renewables, indeed the powerhouse of renewables, yet discriminatory charging is hampering future investment, distorting decisions about the location of that development. And it must be resolved. I think through the energy bill, I fear that Ofgem's CUSC process may not be able to deliver what is needed. But despite the overall general welcome, there are aspects of the draft bill that need further consideration. Decarbonisation of transport and heat will see electricity demand rise significantly, but we should not lose sight of the importance of energy efficiency and conservation, as some have mentioned. I think WWF make an interesting point about the need for enabling powers for energy efficiency in the bill, and I think those have merit. But of course, the contracts for difference is the area perhaps that has attracted most comment. The contracts are an attempt to make investment in clean energy more attractive by removing long-term exposure to price volatility, to establish a strike price for generators, and also, I think, to insulate consumers from large fluctuations as well. Key in terms of addressing fuel poverty that Rhoda Grant, John Wilson, a host of other members have quite rightly sought to emphasise. There is a recognition, though, I think, of the concern about how contracts for difference will operate. A single auction for contracts does appear to favour more mature technologies. It's vital that we secure a technology mix. Marine renewables, for example, I think is an essential part of that mix, and I think the implications for that sector and others have to be taken seriously. Whether the solution here is an extension of ROCs, I'm not at all sure, but I certainly would wish to see those concerns fully addressed as the bill progresses. If I could perhaps say also that in terms of underwriting the contracts, the role of the counterparty is clearly very, very key as well. Scottish Renewables, SSE have all pointed to the need to have a creditworthy counterparty as a means of reducing the costs, and I think more work is needed here to provide the necessary assurances and the confidence. Finally, Scottish Renewables refer to National Grid's role as system operator, able to issue contracts based on targets and geographical location. I'm aware of concerns being raised in the context of constraints on the network and how these would be managed in future. Already, this is an issue that's come into very, very sharp focus in Orkney, where SSE announced that any future installations above 3.7 kilowatts, quote, will be dependent on grid reinforcement, smart network management or changes to demand requirements. Rumours, I think it's fair to say, about these problems of constraint have been circulating for a while. There is some sympathy for the position that SSE find themselves in, but as one constituent observed to me, SSE appears to be managing its way into a crisis over recent months and years. I would certainly invite the Minister to look seriously at that. I would welcome the opportunity to meet with them to discuss the implications of this. I think in terms of demand requirements, there could be opportunities through so-called G83 processes that allow micro-renewables to be connected and feed excess power into storage appliances inside the House. I'll give way to the member. To the Minister.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to meet with Liam MacArthur on this. In fact, I was keen to suggest that, but he's taken that from me. And I'm very keen to try and find some imaginative solutions to the problem about which I was recently made aware.
Mr MacArthur, you must come to a conclusion.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. I think that meeting could also touch on the issue of tele-switching, which was raised with the chair of the Fuel Poverty Forum as a way of using some of the renewable resource currently constrained off the grid, but used in a way that addresses fuel poverty in my constituency. Another issue would also be small community-scale supply businesses, given the concerns that I think have been raised about barriers to entry. I welcome this debate. I welcome the tone of this debate. There's an opportunity to set us on the right track to decarbonise electricity generation, improve security of supply, contain future price rises. And while urgency and clarity is needed, we also must make sure we get it right. I commend the Minister of the motion and the amendment and hope we can continue in this vein. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Roderick Campbell to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The reform of the electricity market is as essential in Scotland as it is across the whole of these islands, and I welcome proposals to ensure security of supply and affordability. It's clearly right that Scottish ministers have a statutory right to be consulted when the UK Government takes forward its proposals, given the importance of matters in Scotland, which is fast becoming the energy powerhouse of the British Isles, even if energy is both reserved and devolved. And certainly we need to work in partnership rather than just as a consultee. But it's certainly imperative that Scottish interests, however, are at the heart of all decision-making processes on electricity markets, including in the key area of the formulation of strategy and policy statement for Ofgem. I also support the Scottish Government's view that Scottish ministers must be closely involved in contracts for difference, which hopefully will provide lasting arrangements for price support to emerging renewable technologies. It's obviously vital that in any transition from renewable obligations to CFDs, that support for renewable generation is maintained, and we need to ensure that the Scottish Government is involved in the detail, which is as yet unclear. Furthermore, the provisions in the Energy Bill relating to offshore transmission are important to prevent difficulties for contractors who are both generators and engaged in transmission, and in order that such vertically integrated suppliers are able to test their transmission with impunity. Changes to the Electricity Act 1989 will be required, and I would hope that this is something that can be resolved quickly through legislation at Westminster. Of course, Reform Scotland's report, published 10 months ago, Powering Scotland, made several recommendations on the future of the energy market, including the recommendation that energy policy should be formally devolved to the Scottish Parliament so that the Scottish Government can formulate a clear energy policy that meets Scotland's needs. For the present, however, we must make sure that we are operating as effectively as possible within the limits of the devolution framework, recognising, of course, the importance of the UK electricity market as a whole. Presiding Officer, there has been considerable concern that the UK Government's plans in the Energy Bill and in its overarching reform of the electricity market, are intended to provide new subsidies for nuclear power. As the Scottish Government and many other organisations, including Reform Scotland, have stated, Scotland does not need new nuclear power stations, and nuclear energy does not merit a boost in funding. As my colleague Kevin Stewart has referred to, WWF have described it as a lose-lose situation, since nuclear is being phased out long-term in any event. And for the avoidance of doubt, Murdo Fraser, I've also not seen any briefing from EDF. But why should nuclear be subsidised, when aside from the enormous costs associated with installation and the reliance on regular imports of uranium from overseas, the cost of security and the cost of decommissioning, and ultimately the cost to the taxpayer and to the environment of storing radioactive waste? Nuclear power also gets extortionately expensive when things go wrong. The insurance limit for operators proposed by the UK government is €1.2 billion. The cost of the Fukushima disaster last year are widely projected to reach around €200 billion. Suppliers of nuclear energy simply could not afford to insure their facilities to a level commensurate with risk without government help. It's surely short-sighted to bolster the nuclear industry, even ignoring the arguments on the impact of EU state aid rules, when to do so beyond the lifespan of current reactors might be at the expense of, as other speakers have suggested, of nascent and truly sustainable Scottish renewable energy sources. And in that respect, I agree with the House of Commons Energy and Climate Change Committee that policy and financial support for nuclear should not be rolled up with that of renewables. In relation to emission performance standards, the same committee in their recent report are as scathing as ever about the proposals. However, control and regulation of emissions is a devolved matter, and I would hope that whatever model of EPS is appropriate for Scotland, it is consistent with delivering our world-leading climate change legislation. Presiding Officer, the aims of both the Scottish Government and the UK Government over the course of the electricity market reform must also ensure that consumers are getting the best deal possible. In the long term, we can only achieve that by promoting sustainable energy production. The only truly infinite resources Scotland has in terms of energy production are human talent and the power of wind and water. Scotland must continue to make a priority of matching and marrying the two. In order to create a world-leading energy industry, and also in order to ensure that the world-leading renewable energy target of 100% of electricity from renewable resources by 2020 is met. An ambition which I'm delighted to learn has been hailed by the UK Government's own Climate Change Secretary, Ed Davey, even if not endorsed so warmly by his Conservative colleagues, including some of those in this chamber. Presiding Officer, rising production costs are in many ways unavoidable, but the success of the vertically integrated Big Six suppliers in the electricity market depends upon competitiveness, and it is essential that the UK and Scottish governments work together to ensure that the imminent reform of the electricity market allows for effective competition. That can only be a good thing for household bills. Last but not least, in this debate, we must also recognise the interests of consumers, particularly those in fuel poverty, as many speakers have mentioned already, and perhaps a more effective recognition of this is required in the reform debate. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Ian Gray to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. You know, telling someone you volunteered for a debate on EMR is a bit like telling them you were once a physics teacher. Their face immediately rearranges itself in an expression which says, oh, really, how dull. But you only have to look at the objectives of this reform to see how important it actually is, decarbonising electricity generation at the very time when every news bulletin is bringing further disturbing news of the impact of climate change. Guaranteeing security of supply when every day sees our leisure, our work life, our industry depend more and more on technologies all powered by electricity. And of course, controlling the cost of the reform to consumers at a time when we know 800,000 Scottish families are fuel poor. And when you add into that electricity as an important added value export from Scotland and the potential, rightly recognised by the Scottish Government, that we can use new technologies to re-industrialise our country, then there is nothing dull at all about EMR. In fact, it's not too strong to say that our way of life depends on getting it right. And the consequences of getting it wrong are already becoming obvious. SSE turned away from some of their proposed hydro investments immediately in response to ROC's decisions by the UK government. And in my own constituency, 1,000 megawatt of capacity at Cockenzie is about to disappear in April, with no investment decision on the horizon, in spite of the Scottish Government having already consented a combined cycle gas turbine replacement. Iberdrola have the investment decision on hold, awaiting EMR decisions. So we are currently in a worrying position where the proposals don't really reform the market, and in particular leave the wholesale market unreformed and don't restore any kind of balance between the interests of the consumer and the big six energy companies. Yet, the complexity of the contracts for difference system and the lack of clarity on a counterparty and a lack of confidence in proposed capacity market auctions has also failed to gain the confidence of the companies themselves, with Ian Marchant of SSE calling them a train wreck. So Cockenzie is just one example of the hiatus in investment, which is either actually resulting from EMR concerns or where EMR is the excuse. Either way, it's not delivering what we need to see happen. And what will not resolve these issues is allowing EMR to become a polarised battleground over competing low-carbon technologies. The Scottish Government position on nuclear is very clear. I think it's wrong, because in my own constituency, Torness is generating reliable, base-load electricity, 15 to 20% of Scotland's electricity day by day. It's doing so right now without carbon emissions, and it's providing 500 highly skilled and well-paid jobs for my constituents. But there is no doubt the Scottish Government are entitled to take the view they do. What they shouldn't do, though, as the Minister did not, is use EMR to try and impose that view on the rest of the UK, lest they undermine their own entirely legitimate arguments that EMR must deliver a market which supports renewables. And at the same time, the UK Government must not allow any hint of dogmatic and irrational anti-renewable and especially anti-wind voices, including those of the new UK Energy Minister in a previous life. They must not allow those to skew EMR against renewables and unfairly in favour of nuclear, because in the long term, it is renewable technologies which hold out the prospect of electricity generation without dependence on finite fuel supplies. Balance has to be the aim. So the Scottish Government should be supported in arguing for transmission charging, contracts for difference, and a capacity market which all incentivise renewable generation, and not just in Scotland, but in all of Scotland, including our islands. But I want to add my voice to Mary Scanlon's and argue that they should also be raising the profile in their discussions of energy storage. Scotland has a long tradition in this area, not least at Cruachan Pump Storage Station. But there is only 2,800 megawatts of pump storage in the whole of the UK, and such installations are in a poor position in the current regime because they pay charges both as generator and as customer. Yesterday, in the Institution of Mechanical Engineers briefing, which Mary Scanlon referred to, they were very, very clear that EMR, as it currently stands, will not incentivise new storage or new storage technologies, and yet many more thousands of megawatts will be required. And this matters especially for Scotland.
Minister.
I just wanted to clarify for Ian Gray that the Scottish Government does believe that it is important that storage is supported and incentivised by the capacity mechanism under EMR.
Ian Gray.
I think that they do, and there is a reference to it indeed in the motion, and I welcome that. My point was simply to try and raise its profile in the debate, because I think this matters particularly for Scotland, as I think the Minister understands, because, of course, storage is part of the answer to genuine concerns about the intermittency of many renewable technologies.
Mr Gray, could I ask you to come to
But more than that, We were shown yesterday a picture of a pilot cryogenic storage plant situated in Slough, but engineered and manufactured in Inverness. There are real opportunities in this too. Indeed, this whole EMR process, you could say, is fraught with opportunity. But the Minister is right that any loss of momentum is fraught with danger, and therefore we should unite behind the motion and the amendment this evening.
Many thanks. I call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When I first got the brief on the EMR and realised it was complex and technical, I asked myself, why am I speaking in this debate? But, Presiding Officer, this is a very important debate, and especially for the constituency of Aberdeenshire West. I've said in this chamber many a time, and to the Minister, that Aberdeenshire West, in conjunction with Aberdeen City, are the lead, not just in oil and gas, but in the renewable, not just in Europe, but for probably the world. Presiding Officer, many have already spoken about the importance of EMR and getting it right. I have great faith in our Minister in going to Westminster as an equal, as a partner in this dialogue, to get it right for Scotland and to do what he does best, and that is talk up Scotland. Presiding Officer, can I associate myself with John Wilson and the elegant way he made his comments with regard to fuel poverty and others within the chamber this afternoon? The consumer should be at the heart of the EMR reform. It needs to be at the heart of this reform, because it's the consumers at the end of the day that are paying the price, and we cannot add to fuel poverty in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I want to change tact slightly, because I think earlier the Minister in his statement with RO gives confidence to the industry. It will give confidence for the industry to invest in Scotland. And it will give confidence to our universities and colleges to bring forward our young people for the skills that we will need for the renewable energy programme for the future of Scotland. There is a great deal of work being done at the moment, I know, within the RGU in Aberdeen University and the colleges, working together, looking at the renewable sector, looking forward, looking ahead to try and ensure that we have the workforce for the future, for the development of renewables in Scotland. Presiding Officer, we need to take this opportunity to reform. And I actually do believe the transition charging is a scandal. And we have the opportunity to look at fairness and equity. And I actually believe it is in the gift of the EMR to try and ensure that this happens. I would urge the Minister to do what he can to try and ensure that the transmission charging is equal and fair, so we can have our renewable sector lead the way in our islands. Rhoda Grant said it eloquently earlier, and I can echo the words of Rhoda Grant. It is the potential that we have that will make this country great in the future as well. Presiding Officer, we have to move forward. We cannot look back. We cannot allow nuclear to be part of, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many members in this chamber, to be subsidised through the EMR programme. The EMR programme is for the future, and renewables is the future for Scotland. I support the motion and I support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I understand the Minister's desire for a motion which gave rise to a consensual approach regarding renewables, and I'm grateful to him for agreeing to some minor changes to the text of his motion, particularly removing explicit support for the principles of EMR, removing reference to investment in thermal generation and including a reference to demand reduction. These changes are enough, just about, for me to vote for the motion, and I'll also happily vote for the amendment from Rhoda Grant. Honestly, though, I would have preferred a debate which allowed full expression of the very serious concerns that do exist about the direction in which the UK Government is taking electricity market reform. My amendment, which wasn't selected for debate, so members will have to turn to the back of the business bulletin if they want to read it instead of the front, did set out some of those concerns, including about demand reduction, as well as the favourable context for fossil fuel and nuclear generation, which will be set, and the proposals for a decarbonisation target and a Scottish emission performance standard. It seems pretty clear that the direction of EMR will set the agenda for a dash for gas and new nuclear. And to quote Scottish and Southern Energy in their briefing, contract for difference is a one-size-fits-all support mechanism which is suitable for nuclear but not for renewables or for carbon capture and storage. The latest design proposals actually increase rather than reduce the risks and costs for renewable developers. Similar concerns have been expressed by WWF, who note that the Scottish Government has a commitment to a largely decarbonised electricity sector by 2030, and they've called for such a commitment for the whole of the UK to be included in the legislation. Stuart Stevenson referred as well to the letter from the UK Committee on Climate Change, published just today, about a carbon intensity target for the power sector, and calling for that to be included. Extensive use, they say, of unabated gas-fired capacity in 2030 and beyond would be incompatible with meeting legislated carbon budgets. And they go on to criticise the apparently ambivalent position of the UK Government about whether it's trying to build a low-carbon power system or a gas-based power system. We should take these concerns very seriously. We should also look at the option suggested by WWF of an emission performance standard for Scotland. The UK Government's proposal is set at such a high level, 450 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, that it will lock us into high-carbon energy generation, another generation of fossil-fuelled power stations for years and years to come. The UK Parliament's Energy and Climate Change Committee have called that proposal pointless and said again that it could endanger our meeting our climate change targets. The Scottish Government does have the power under existing devolved powers to develop a Scottish-specific EPS, one that's consistent with Scotland's priority, with Scotland's greater ambition, as we kept congratulating ourselves for year after year when we debated the climate change legislation. If we're serious about that, let's set a serious emission performance standard. As well as gas, there is the threat of more new nuclear power stations, as the same organisations have suggested. Now, there may be some who say, well, if England wants to do that, that's their affair. Scotland's already got a position that says we won't have new nuclear in Scotland. But the reality is that we will still be part of an integrated electricity market, and the immense subsidies that will be spent on nuclear power will be borne by consumers in Scotland as well. And so we must challenge from our position of opposition to new nuclear in Scotland, we must challenge the UK Government's position as well. I support the comments which were made by Mary Scanlon and by Ian Gray about storage. It is clear that a more renewable electricity supply will need more storage, and this is certainly an area where greater incentives for the creative investment which are needed should be included. Presiding Officer, I am sorry that the vote tonight won't allow the opportunity to record these criticisms when we look at the motions and amendment that will actually be voted on. It's important that the Scottish Government continues to make the case for change in its discussion with the UK Government. And important as well that we remember the context in which that is happening. The appointment by the UK Government of Owen Paterson and John Hayes to positions of importance in this area. I draw members' attention to the comments by Roger Harrabin of the BBC, who's been asking DEFRA and DEC repeatedly since these two gentlemen's appointment whether they in fact accept the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on which UK and Scottish climate change policy is based. He's not had a reply. DEC press office, he says, simply ignore the question, while a source at DEFRA told me it wasn't a priority for Mr Paterson to answer. These are both people who've spoken out strongly against wind power and at least flirted with climate denial. Now, if these people are going to pursue this dash for gas and a new nuclear agenda at the expense of renewable energy in the UK or in Scotland, then George Monbiot is right that their appointment represents a declaration of war on the environment by the Prime Minister. And that's the context in which the Scottish Government is going to have to raise these issues with its counterparts down south. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. We now turn to closing speeches, and I call on Murdo Fraser with a generous 6 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by commending Fergus Ewing for the very consensual manner in which he has approached this debate. Electricity market reform, energy market reform, is a complex and technical subject. I think there are very few of us who would profess great expertise. It was curious during the debate, Presiding Officer, how few members were prepared to debate the relative merits of having different counterparties and contracts for difference, although I think Ian Gray came closest to getting into the technicalities, as perhaps befits a former teacher of physics. I do not think there are great differences, actually, between political parties and what we are trying to achieve, with the exception of some areas such as new nuclear power, which are more contentious and which I'll say more about in a moment if time allows. I thought we had some very good contributions. I thought Stuart Stevenson, in his return to the backbench, made a very well considered contribution. And I thought John Wilson made some excellent points which I would agree with about the need to put the consumer at the centre of this policy and address the growing concern there is about levels of fuel poverty and the need to try and keep energy bills down as much as we can. On the Conservative benches, we had some concerns with the terms of the Labour amendment this afternoon. It brings in the separate but related issue of transmission charging and Project Transmit. This was an issue we debated in the Chamber just before the summer recess, and at that time the Scottish Conservatives made clear our concern about a move to a socialised system which would spread the cost of transmission across all consumers and would result, according to figures provided by Ofgem, in a substantial rise in bills for consumers in remote parts of Scotland and, in particular, the north. And we made it clear this was not an approach we could possibly support. I'm very grateful to the Minister for the clarity he provided at the start of the debate, and indeed to Rhoda Grant in clarifying that the amendment does not support a socialised approach, and on that basis we're very happy to support the Labour amendment. As other members have said during the debate, the purpose of energy market reform is to remove our current system of subsidies through ROCs and FITs and replace them with a new system based on contracts for difference. Now, I think you need to be something of an expert in economics and finance to explain in detail how exactly this might work in practice. So let me look at the principles behind this approach rather than the detail. I think everybody would agree on the need to decarbonise the electricity supply. DEC have stated their intention of improving security of supply, recognising a rising demand for electricity and a general upward trend in terms of electricity prices. So far, so good. I think we all recognise that the cheapest form of electricity is that produced from burning fossil fuels. And if costs were the only factor to be borne in mind, we would simply continue to do that. But I do not think there is anyone in the Chamber who thinks that is a sensible approach, partly because of the impact of carbon on the atmosphere and partly because of issues around security of supply. And that means looking at lower carbon sources of energy. That means we can continue to burn fossil fuels with the addition of carbon capture and storage. But that, of course, increases costs and reduces efficiency. Or we can go for nuclear power, which I have always supported as a low-carbon source of power, although I accept there will be others who take a different view. And whereas nuclear is more expensive than conventional generation, most experts consider it to be cheaper than renewables. And contrary to what John Wilson said about the, I think I quote him correctly, the prohibitive costs of nuclear, he was there when I was listening to the briefing we had in the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee from Scottish Government officials. Officials, I should say, who I would expect would have no pro-nuclear bias, but told us that the lifetime costs of nuclear, including decommissioning, were comparable to the lifetime costs of developing onshore wind. And then, of course, in terms of the hierarchy of costs, we have renewable energy. Currently, onshore wind is the most mature technology, and the costs of this are reducing, but they're still substantially more and conventional generation, which of course is why it continues to be subsidised. Indeed, we heard in the Minister's statement earlier this afternoon that the levels of subsidy, albeit reduced to a marginal degree, will continue. Then we have offshore wind, which is more expensive still. And then, of course, and this is something which energy market reform is seeking to try and encourage. Now, it is clear what is being proposed by DEC is only the start. There's a lot more discussion to be had, but I hope we can agree the general principles, and that is what the Minister's motion appears to do. And I would agree with many members who spoke about the need for greater certainty. One thing that is clear is that the investment community are scared off by uncertainty about future levels of support. And I was interested in the number of SNP members who were prepared to make that point, but I completely missed the related point that there is another level of uncertainty caused, which, of course, is about the future of our energy market across the United Kingdom. And that's based on our constitutional future. And if members had read the submission from Scottish and Southern Energy to the Economy and Energy Tourism Committee precisely on that point, they would see there is investor uncertainty about that point as much as there is about the future of energy market. Yes, Dolly.
Stuart Stevenson.
Is the member aware of the decades since the installation of a cable connecting France and England, demonstrating that it is entirely practical to have different jurisdictions collaborating in matters of energy policy?
Murdo Fraser.
I don't think it's a question of collaboration, Mr Stevenson. It's a question if we are going to develop renewables in large numbers and they require subsidy, and we're going to be a country of 5 million consumers rather than 60 million consumers, we will need to consider very carefully where that money will come from. And if we could enter into forward contracts with the rest of the United Kingdom in advance of separation, that might work. But we need to see that in practice, and there's no sign of it coming forward right at the moment. But I hope that the UK Government and DEC, and I know they've been engaging constructively together with the Scottish Government, and I hope that will continue. If I've got time to make a couple more points, Presiding Officer, one thing interesting that nobody's mentioned in the proposed bill is that the UK Government are proposing that local councils will be able to keep business rates paid by wind farm operators. Now, this clearly is an issue of great interest in many parts of Scotland, not least in Perth and Kinross, in my own area, and I hope this is something that the Scottish Government would be prepared to look at, and I'm sure my colleagues in the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee will be interested in this approach. The bill talks about the need for tariff reform. I think that's vitally important, trying to drive down bills, making it easier to switch and making lower tariffs more transparent, as Rhoda Grant fairly pointed out. And finally, if I may, Presiding Officer, we need greater energy efficiency. And here I agree. I don't say this very often. I agree with Patrick Harvey. The cheapest form of energy is that which is not used at all. And we need to do much more in terms of demand reduction rather than having to produce more electricity at ever-increasing costs. Overall, Presiding Officer, there's a lot of detail to go through, but despite the differences, there's a lot of common ground, and I hope that the UK and the Scottish Governments can work together to find solutions. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Ken McIntosh with a generous 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And there's a favourite Woody Allen film of mine, Presiding Officer, called Zelig, in which the eponymous hero pops up in improbable and unlikely places alongside President Woodrow Wilson, Babe Ruth, and even alongside Hitler, I think, at the Nuremberg rallies. And as a character, he came to my mind over the summer when I took the opportunity for the first time ever to visit the nuclear power station at Hunterston. And if you haven't been there, by the way, those from Ayrshire will know this. It's a beautiful setting, absolutely beautiful place. So I was visiting the nuclear power station, and who should I find there but the Minister himself, Fergus Ewing, the SNP Cabinet Secretary for Energy. Now, we know SNP ministers, often the Grand Panjandrum himself, are a ubiquitous presence at virtually any opening, whatever significance, any minor significance. But this is the very same SNP who have remorselessly played on anti-nuclear sentiment for years. And there are many SNP members, and from their contributions today, I clearly count Kevin Stewart, Gil Patterson, John Wilson and Dennis Robertson amongst them, for whom opposition to nuclear power is still an article of faith. But there he was, not quite luring us in, sweeties and lollies in hand, but the unembarrassable Cabinet Secretary, heart swelling with pride as he welcomed us to this brand new nuclear-powered Scotland. And, Presiding Officer, it has been a pleasure today to continue to make common ground with the Minister and with members across the Chamber in a nuclear aside, a very consensual debate on electricity market reform. As a country and as a Parliament, I think we're rightly proud that we have taken a lead in setting ambitious climate change and carbon reduction targets. The principles underpinning the UK Government's reform certainly point us in the right direction to meet those targets, but now we have to will the means to make those changes happen. And that's not necessarily going to be a straightforward process. As Scottish Renewables highlighted, we have concerns about the complexity of the proposals, the introduction of new risks and the risk of timetables slipping. The bill has a number of weaknesses too, which have been highlighted this afternoon. Despite being called electricity market reform, the draft bill does little to reform the electricity market to make it work in the interests of the consumer rather than the big six. It was a point made by several, including my colleague Ian Gray, and I thought very forcefully by Mary Scanlon. These six huge companies do not just dominate electricity supply, but the tariffs offered to consumers. And as my colleague Rhoda Grant highlighted, we need a system which encourages new entrants, particularly at a local community level. Similarly, the draft bill contains few measures on demand reduction, yet this is not just essential for climate change targets, it's crucial for tackling fuel poverty too, a point made by Claudia Beamish. There are a number of other concerns, and all will need to be addressed by the UK Government, but several members have highlighted issues which require leadership and commitment from the Scottish Government too. Perhaps the most prominent, and one which we have highlighted in our addendum to today's motion, is that of ensuring a fair and equitable grid connection to our islands. And I would like to, in response to both Mary Scanlon and Murdo Fraser's earlier interventions, to reassure them that this does not mean the so-called socialised system of charging. And in fact, from the Minister's remarks, it sounds as though we are all singing from the same hymn sheet on this issue. But to take the Western Isles as an example, the Outer Hebrides offers more than 600 megawatts of new renewable energy generation currently under active consideration or under development. And it is essential, in order to meet our carbon targets, if we wish to help our island communities, and just on the grounds of fairness, that the interconnector to transport that electricity to market goes ahead. The review of transmission charges is yet to be finally signed off. Project Transmit has offered some welcome improvement on the previous charging regime, but it would appear that any further adjustments to the broad conclusions of Project Transmit may be modest. And I thought Liam MacArthur described well the distorting effect of imbalanced transmission charges. If we want these projects in the Western Isles and Orkney and Shetland to go ahead, I believe we will need the Scottish Government to produce a specific renewable obligation certificate for island wind power. Now, one of the reasons for using ROCs to help promote renewable energy is the benefit they provide to what are still fragile local economies, not just in the islands but across Scotland. It's not simply the income from these towers which benefit villages, it's the fact that local people are in control, actively participating in the decisions which affect the sustainability of their communities. In many cases, such community-owned renewables can also make a direct impact on fuel poverty. The huge hikes in fuel prices in recent years have plunged more and more people into difficulties, unable to pay their heating and electricity bills. And I thought it was a point particularly well made by John Wilson. Although electricity market reform aims to create cleaner electricity and to improve security of supply, that's to ensure the lights stay on, it remains relatively weak in addressing fuel poverty. There are incentives to improve the energy efficiency of our homes, but it is questionable whether those in greatest need will be the ones to take greatest advantage. And I believe the Scottish Government needs to continue looking at how we identify and then help those low-income and fuel-poor households most at risk, including looking at projects which allow communities to generate their own electricity. Presiding Officer, I began my remarks by referring to the Minister's newfound love for all things nuclear. And he followed this up in his statement on the renewables obligation earlier by making a virtue of seeking consistency across the UK. It's little wonder then that it's been such a consensual debate this afternoon. From the way in which he then neatly sidestepped my colleague James Kelly's question, I gather he may not entirely share our view on the undoubted union dividend of a single UK energy market. But there's clearly a commitment to work together across the parties and across the Parliament. If I may make one more point before concluding, one more point, President Officer. It's actually following up on the renewables obligation earlier, and that's to ask the Minister for greater clarity and the need to reassure communities across Scotland about electricity generation from incineration, from burning waste. It's not right that waste operators are trying to get round local planning controls and avoid accountability to local residents by applying directly to Scottish ministers for Section 36 consent. Often, these are speculative money-making exercises, disingenuously disguised and dressed up in environmentally friendly language. And a stronger line from the Government that these projects are neither in line with the Scottish Government's zero waste strategy nor in line with the Scottish Government's renewable energy strategy. I believe it wouldn't entirely remove the threat from developers, but it would certainly give communities greater confidence that they're unlikely to succeed. Presiding Officer, in concluding, I thought Stuart Stevenson indeed also made as he often does, a particularly powerful and thoughtful contribution down to his tropical tennis metaphor. And he talked about the need for long-term fiscal certainty and security if we are to secure long-term investment in renewables. Presiding Officer, we are indeed in this for the long term, and although there remain many complexities to resolve, I believe if we can maintain this level of shared purpose, we can deliver a secure future for consumers, for our businesses, for our environment, and I commend the amendment and the motion today.
Many thanks. And I now call on Fergus Ewing to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've thoroughly enjoyed this debate, and I think that across the Chamber we've had a large number of very useful contributions, and I will try to reply to many of those in a moment. But before I do so, could I say that I set out, when I drafted the motion with others, to try and provide the wording of a motion which would allow Parliament to unite, because I think we do have a more common ground than one might think. And I think this debate has exemplified that we do have common ground, and I'm confident that we will all unite across all parties in this chamber at decision time. And I'm very grateful to members in all parties for the work prior to this debate and their contributions to this debate. I'd also like to make another reflection, well, an undertaking and a reflection. An undertaking that I will ask my officials to study all the contributions that I've made, not just in this debate, but also in the question-answer session on the statement about renewable obligations contracts which preceded it, because there were some points like Claudia Beamish to which I don't think I answered sufficiently with sufficient clarity earlier on, and some contributions during this debate which I think merit some thought. After all, the purpose of debates in this Parliament is not just to fill the time, not just to allow us to express our views, but it's also to allow the government to gain a better policy formulation going forward. And I actually think that this debate in some ways will allow us to achieve that, and those who've contributed positively, and that's been the vast majority, I think really all the contributions, will do that. I mean, Patrick Harvey pointed out demand reduction is not in the motion, but I think we all agree that we subscribe to that, as indeed I know the UK government does. It's not perhaps directly relevant to EMR as such, but of course we are all entirely committed to demand reduction for the reasons that Murdo Fraser and Patrick Harvey said. So far as our... certainly, yes.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Can I ask, when he's asking his officials to respond to contributions within the debate, can I also ask for a response to the Institute of Mechanical Engineers paper presented to the Parliament this week on electricity storage?
Minister.
You can, and I will, and I was going to come to that. I just wanted to say that the Scottish Government's policy on electricity generation is that we should seek to deliver a number of objectives. And I think we've all, in this debate, by our contributions, illustrated that these are the objectives which, in fact, we share. And these are, first, a secure source of electricity supply. And that must have an element of variety to it to be secure. Secondly, it must be at an affordable cost to consumers. Thirdly, which will be largely decarbonised by 2030, for the reasons that Stuart Stevenson so eloquently set out. And finally, which achieves the greatest possible economic benefit and competitive advantage for Scotland, including opportunities for community ownership and community benefits. And I thought many members set out the case and the need for more measures to tackle fuel poverty very, very clearly. Mary Scanlon, Rhoda Grant, Claudia Beamish set out these arguments, as did Kevin Stewart, John Wilson, and I think these were well made. And of course, to tackle fuel poverty, we need to do a huge variety of things, involving the electricity companies, involving the government, involving policy formulation. And I'd like just to give two examples of how the success in onshore wind power can help tackle fuel poverty. Some amusement was had, I think at my expense, by Mr McIntosh's contribution. I certainly enjoyed it anyway, in relation to my very pleasant visit to Hunterston, where I was delighted to open the new Centre for Education so that young people will be allowed to see how all forms of electricity are generated. I think that must be a good thing, to have knowledge about all techniques, irrespective of who approves and who doesn't. It must be a good thing for the purpose of education. So I enjoyed my day out in Hunterston. But the reason I mention it is, of course, the EDF are also behind renewable projects, including the Stornoway wind farm, to which consent was recently granted by moi, being a French company. C'est bon. So, and what I know Rhoda Grant will know, but other members probably won't, is that, I hadn't actually intended to say that, Presiding Officer, but there we are. Shucks, as they say. The community benefit for that one wind farm project will be £2 million a year, according to reports that I've read. Now, £2 million a year is surely enough to make serious inroads to tackle fuel poverty in the Western Isles, which Dr Alistair Allen has told me, and Claudia Beamish argued today, off gas grid, is amongst the most serious in our country. So, just in a moment. So, if that money can be harnessed to tackle fuel poverty, that must be a good thing. And equally, in respect of the Shetland Viking project, the community benefit combined, I am told, will be between 20 and 30 million. Now, these are huge advantages. It's up to the local people there and the local representatives to decide how these windfalls are deployed. But surely, Presiding Officer, these are golden opportunities to tackle fuel poverty in this country once and for all. So I commend the contributions that were made on that topic. And I'll give way to Murdo.
I'm most grateful to the Minister for giving way. If the very generous sum of £2 million per annum is paid from the operators of this wind farm, can they tell us how much profits they are making, out of which they can afford to pay this very generous sum?
Minister.
Well, that's the sort of intervention I would have expected from a sort of proto-communist, you know. Up till now, I thought the Conservatives were in favour of companies making profits. I'm afraid I haven't studied the EDF balance sheet, but I was pleased that their community benefit tariff is near the £5,000 a megawatt rate, which has been the yardstick provided by the Forestry Commission and SSE and RWE. So I was pleased about that, and I think we're all pleased still, just. So far as storage is concerned, I thought Ian Gray made an extremely worthwhile contribution, and I will reread it and ask my officials to do so, because I think he's absolutely right, and other members have mentioned it, Mary Scanlon initially, that storage is a perfect complement, if you like, to wind power, which is intermittent in its nature, to hydro in particular, where it can form purpose. And I'm delighted that Highview Power in my constituency have installed a compressed liquid nitrogen energy storage system manufactured in Inverness and assembled in Slough, a cross-border partnership. I'm also pleased to say that in other disciplines such as hydrogen, we're seeing an exciting initiative take place in Aberdeen, and our academics, our universities, to which Dennis Robertson rightly paid tribute, and indeed our colleges, are leading the world in the advancement of technology in many renewable energy areas. For example, Professor Martin Tangney in relation to biofuels. I just mention that because of the breadth of the work in Scotland in renewables, Presiding Officer. But moving towards a close in this debate, I'm conscious that there's much claim and counterclaim that wind power is more expensive. Let me just go over the facts with you so that we can agree about these as well. First of all, the RO cost of the average household is £15 a year, and we estimate that by 2017 that will rise to £50. However, volatile fuel prices from fossil fuels have in recent years added almost £300 between 2004 and 210. So the canard that onshore wind is more expensive is precisely that. And of course, it is not a pick and mix package, presiding officer. It is the success of onshore that has led to the rationale for Ofgem and the national grid to improve £7,000 million of investment to our grid, to strengthen our grid. Without the strengthening of the grid, there can be no offshore, there can be no wave and tidal. It is onshore that has led to the grid rationale. It is grid rationale that's led to the potential for exploiting our wave and tidal energy, and that gives us the opportunity to be the pioneer of that marine energy in the whole world. It is not a pick and mix, and I think gradually that argument is becoming understood, so that, as President Barack Obama said, presiding officer, the country that leads the development of new forms of energy will be the country that leads the world economy. That sounds a good enough ambition for us all to share this evening.
That concludes the debate on the electricity market reform. We now move to decision time. There are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 4082.1 in the name of Rhoda Grant, which seeks to amend motion number 4082 in the name of Fergus Ewing on electricity market reform be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4082 in the name of Fergus Ewing as amended on electricity market reform be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting.